We're now moving on to page 4 of the Value Finding Appraisal Report. The USPAP Standard Rule. The next one is Standard Rule 2-2 AVII. It says state the effective date of the appraisal and the date of the report. And the effective date of the appraisal is January 8th, 2019. For an eminent domain real estate acquisition function, generally, that effective date of the appraisal is the date that the appraiser inspected the property. The date of a report, which in this case was January 30th, 2019, is going to be the date that the value finding appraisal report is completely written, and the appraiser will then sign the value finding, and that is the date that usually goes in on the date of report. They're two different dates, but the date of value is going to be the effective date of appraisal, the date of inspection. The next USPAP standard is 2-2 AVII. Summarize the scope of work used to develop the appraisal. This is a relatively long section where we outline the 5 steps in the scope, and then also add on to that the appraisal scoping checklist, a paragraph about the comparable sales, and also a paragraph that the scope of work is limited to a fractional interest. In Standard Rule 1-2, EV permits an appraiser to limit the scope of work to a fractional interest, physical segment, or partial holding. The comment to this rule states, to avoid communicating a misleading appraisal, the appraiser has to disclose the existence of improvements on the property, even though those improvements do not have to be included in the valuation. So, the value finding appraisal report, we are appraising a fractional interest. We're only looking at the whole property as a vacant site. We're ignoring improvements that are on the site but outside the take area. We've inserted a statement in there that the appraiser is required to state if there are structures or improvements not considered. And in this case, there are. And that gray area is where the appraiser can write in structures that aren't included. And partially, it's going to read the whole property is improved with several structures that are a single-family residential dwelling, a detached barn, a smaller outbuilding, and a swimming pool. These improvements are not considered in the scope of work as they're outside the take areas and have been determined by the, well, then it bleeds on to the next page. Appraiser to not be affected by the WD&T acquisitions. They are mentioned here to avoid producing a misleading appraisal report. Okay, the scope of work continues with appraiser comments, and there's quite a few comments here. First paragraph says, in compliance with the 2018-19 edition of USPAP Standard Rule 2-2A of VIII, summarize the scope of work used to develop the appraisal. The appraiser has identified 3 issues pertaining to scope that affect the compensation estimate in this appraisal report. These issues required ODOT to provide specific instruction to the appraiser and are: 1. Fencing. Property before the taking had chain link fencing along its frontage with State Route 73. All of the fencing is taken in the 1WD acquisition. Small portions of this fence encroach into existing right-of-way, and this is not a permitted encroachment. However, the vast majority of the fence does not encroach, and ODOT has instructed the appraiser to ignore the encroachment. This instruction is in the appraisal scoping checklist. Therefore, in this appraisal, any portion of the fence that encroaches into current rights-of-way is ignored, and all parts of the fence is considered as a compensable site improvement. Number 2, stone pillars. Before the taking, along both sides of the drive entrance into State Route 73 are stone wall and pillars which are taken in the 1WD acquisition. The pillars nearest the road on both sides of the drive encroach into existing road right-of-way, and this is not a permitted encroachment. However, most of the walled site improvements do not encroach, and ODOT has instructed the appraiser to ignore the encroachment. This instruction is in the appraisal scoping checklist. Therefore, in this appraisal, any portion of the stone pillar that encroaches into current rights-of-way is ignored, and all parts are considered as compensable site improvements taken. 3, nominal cost to cure. ODOT procedure for the value finding appraisal report allows an appraiser to consider a nominal cost to cure without having to first show the amount of total severance damages and then proving the feasibility of the cure before the project. The property had security from intrusion off State Route 73. The security consisted of approximately 519 feet of 4-foot high vinyl covered chain link fence along the frontage of State Route 73, stone wall and pillars on either side of the drive entrance, and a metal electronic gate at the drive entrance that restricted access onto the property. Continuing, these site improvements are taken by the 1WD acquisition. The residue no longer has any security from intrusion along the residue property's 558 feet of State Route 73 frontage. Nominal cost to cure would provide the owner with compensation to voluntarily restore these site improvements on the residue. The need for a cost to cure was not considered in the appraisal scoping checklist. Therefore, the appraiser discussed the need for a nominal cost to cure with the district real estate advantager on January 15, 2019, and all parties agreed that a nominal cost to cure to reestablish security and privacy along the frontage with State Route 73 is reasonable. Therefore, in this appraisal, a nominal cost to cure is considered in the overall compensation estimate. These comments are probably longer than what would be typical, but they certainly illustrate what needs to happen in a value finding appraisal report when we're dealing with things that are unusual, such as encroachments and nominal cost to cure. All right, moving on to page 6. The next use PAP standard is 2-2AIX. Summarize the extent of any significant real property appraisal assistance. And in this particular one, we marked no, that there wasn't any. If the answer happened to be yes, then the appraiser would need to write into that gray area what type of assistance was given. The next use PAP standard rule 2-2AX1, summarize the appraisal method and techniques employed. Everything in there is boilerplated. Appraiser isn't going to have much of a chance to change any of that. Next use PAP standard is 2-2AX2, state the reasons for excluding the sales comparison cost or income approaches, if any have not been developed. Again, everything in that use PAP standard is also boilerplated. Next use PAP standard is 2-2AX3, summarize the results of analyzing the subject sales that occurred within 5 years prior to the effective date of appraisal, standard rule 2-5B, agreements for sale, options, and listings in accordance with standards rule 1-5. And we've got a star there. It says the use PAP standard rule requires a 3-year history. But this is superseded by federal regulation, 49 CFR 24103, paragraph A2I, that requires the appraiser to analyze at least a 5-year sales history. Therefore, ODOT requires the appraiser to analyze any prior sales that occurred during the previous 5 years. So, in this case, per the ODOT title report, there have been no sales of the property within the last 5 years. The next use PAP standard for this page is 2-2AX4. It says state any value opinions and conclusions. This section is auto-populated from information reported on the next several pages of the value finding report. We'll go over that here shortly. Time for a knowledge check.